is one of the oldest crops humans ever grew. It gave us the world's first paper. People were getting high on it 2,500 years ago at funerals to talk to the dead. Ancient shamans were buried with piles of it. And here is the twist that makes the whole story so strange. For almost all of human history, this plant was completely normal, a tool, a medicine, a sacred gift. The idea of banning it, that's the modern invention. This is the weird, 6,000-year history of cannabis. The story starts not with getting high, but with rope. Cannabis, in the form of hemp, is one of the very first plants humanity ever farmed. In Neolithic China, more than 6,000 years ago, early farmers were already growing it, and we know because they pressed hemp cord into their wet clay pottery, leaving its imprint for us to find. They spun it into cloth, twisted it into rope, and ate its seeds. This humble weed was, quite literally, one of the threads that civilization was built on. And that same plant gave us something world-changing. Around 2,000 years ago, in Han Dynasty China, people learned to mash hemp fibers into pulp and dry them into thin sheets, creating the world's very first paper, more than 1,000 years before Europe caught on. So the next time you write something down, remember, the technology started with this plant. But somewhere along the way, humans discovered this plant did something else entirely. High in the frozen Pamir Mountains of western China, archaeologists opened a 2,500-year-old cemetery and found wooden braziers, bowls full of stones burned black. When they tested the residue, it lit up with the chemical signature of strong, psychoactive cannabis. This is the oldest hard proof we have of people burning cannabis specifically to get high. And the setting, a graveyard. Picture the scene. Mourners gathered around the grave in the thin mountain air, dropping cannabis onto red-hot stones, filling an enclosed space with thick smoke, while musicians played. They weren't doing it for fun. They were using the smoke to enter a trance, to blur the line between the living and the dead, and send their prayers to the other side. The world's oldest known high was a religious experience. Not far away in the Yonghai tombs, archaeologists found something even more remarkable. The grave of a man who died around 45 years old, buried with nearly 2 pounds of cannabis carefully arranged near his head. It was still so well preserved that scientists could analyze it, and found it was potent and made almost entirely of the flowering tops, the strongest part of the plant. This was no accident. Someone, 27 centuries ago, was deliberately growing high-quality weed. He was likely a shaman, buried with the tools of his trade. Meanwhile, out on the vast grasslands, roamed the Scythians, fierce nomadic horse warriors. And around 440 BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote down something he'd heard about them. Inside small felt tents, he said, the Scythians would throw cannabis onto hot stones, and the whole tent would fill with a vapor so strong that the men inside howled with joy. Herodotus thought it was just their version of a bath. He had no idea he was describing a 2,000-year-old party. For centuries, people assumed Herodotus was just repeating a tall tale. And then in the 1940s, a Soviet archaeologist dug into a frozen tomb in Siberia and pulled out the exact kit Herodotus had described. The little tent frame, the bowl, the burnt stones, and the cannabis seeds. A rumor written down 2,500 years ago, proven true by a body frozen in the ice. History sometimes keeps the receipts. Further south in India, cannabis took a very different path. It became holy. Ground into a drink called bhang, it appears in a sacred text over 3,000 years old, listed as one of 5 sacred plants said to release anxiety. It became deeply tied to the great god Shiva, sometimes called the Lord of Bhang. And this is not ancient history that died out. To this very day, millions of people drink bhang during festivals like Holi, in a religious tradition that has continued, unbroken, for 3,000 years. Back in China, cannabis became one of the cornerstones of ancient medicine. An old pharmacy text warns that taking too much of it makes you see devils. But used correctly, it was prescribed for dozens of ailments. And one legendary surgeon named Hua Chuo did something astonishing with it. Nearly 2,000 years ago, He is said to have knocked his patients out cold for surgery using a mysterious mix of cannabis boiled in wine, quite possibly the first general anesthetic in human history. As cannabis spread west into the medieval Islamic world, people discovered how to collect its sticky resin and press it into a potent concentrate called hashish. It became woven into poetry and mysticism, but it also picked up a legend, a dark story that a secret order of killers, the so-called assassins, were fueled by hashish before their missions. It's a gripping tale. It's also almost certainly a myth, a smear invented by their enemies, later spiced up by a European traveler's tall tale. The real history rarely needs the exaggeration. The plant kept traveling. Carried by traders across the Indian Ocean, cannabis, known here as daga, took root across Africa. And in a cave in Ethiopia, archaeologists found two pottery pipe bowls that tested positive for cannabis, dated to around the year 1320, among the oldest smoking pipes ever chemically confirmed anywhere on Earth. From there, the habit spread south across the continent along the trade routes, carried from village to village. Then cannabis crossed the ocean to the Americas, but not to get anyone high. It came as hemp, the industrial workhorse, to make the rope and sails that empires needed. In fact, colonial Virginia was so desperate for it that in 1619, they passed a law legally requiring farmers to grow hemp. Even George Washington grew it on his farm. But let's kill a myth right here. They were growing tough industrial fiber for rope, not something to smoke. And no, the Constitution was not written on hemp paper. For centuries in America, cannabis was just a boring farm crop and a common ingredient in medicines you could buy at any pharmacy. The idea of smoking it for pleasure only arrived later, in the early 1900s, carried in by workers and travelers, and taking root in the music halls and jazz clubs of cities like New Orleans. It was here that the plant picked up a new, foreign-sounding name that would soon be used against it: marijuana. And that name was no accident. As anti-immigrant fear grew, the plant that Americans had happily used for a century was rebranded. Officials deliberately started calling it marijuana, a Spanish-sounding word, to make it feel foreign, exotic, and dangerous, and to tie it in the public mind to the immigrants they wanted to target. It's one of the most effective and cynical rebranding campaigns in history. Same plant, brand new fear. Leading the charge was a man named Harry Anslinger, the head of America's brand new drug bureau. Anslinger built a national panic almost single-handedly, feeding newspapers lurid, often completely invented horror stories about the drug driving people to madness and violence. He collected them in what he called his gore file. The campaign was steeped in the racism of its time, and it worked spectacularly. This was the era of the infamous film Reefer Madness, which showed clean-cut young people taking a single puff and instantly descending into insanity, crime, and death. It was absurd propaganda, but combined with Anslinger's relentless campaign, the fear became law. In 1937, the government effectively banned cannabis across the entire country, and a plant humans had used for 6,000 years became a criminal substance almost overnight. Decades later, the crackdown went into overdrive. In 1970, cannabis was officially placed in the most dangerous drug category the law had, sitting right alongside heroin, and officially declared to have no accepted medical use whatsoever. The very same plant that ancient Chinese surgeons had used as anesthetic, and Indian holy men had used as a sacrament for 3,000 years, was now, on paper, one of the most dangerous substances known to the state. And now for the question everyone actually wants answered. What is the deal with the number 420? The truth is refreshingly silly. Around 1971, a group of California high school students who called themselves the Waldos used to meet at Fort Wently in the afternoon to go hunting for a rumored abandoned cannabis crop. They never found it, but their little code word for the meetup, Fort Wently, stuck, spread, and somehow became the worldwide number for cannabis. And no, despite what you may have heard, it was never a police radio code. For most of the 20th century, that was the story, a ban plan and a war against it. But quietly, the tide began to turn. Scientists rediscovered what ancient healers had always known, that the plant had real medicinal power, easing pain, nausea, and seizures. Patients and activists began to fight back against a ban that, the more you looked at its origins, seemed to rest on fear and prejudice rather than fact. And then the dam broke. In 1996, California became the first state to legalize cannabis for medical use. Others followed. Then, in 2012, Colorado and Washington took the historic leap of legalizing it for adults entirely. Uruguay became the first country in the world to fully legalize it, and Canada soon became the first major world power to follow. A plant that had been demonized for 80 years was suddenly, rapidly, becoming legal again. Which brings us all the way back around. This plant was one of the first things we ever farmed. It clothed us, it gave us paper, it healed us, and it carried our prayers to the dead. For nearly 6,000 years, across almost every culture on Earth, cannabis was simply a normal, useful, sacred part of human life. The bizarre chapter, the truly weird part of the whole story, wasn't the ancient people getting high in their tents. It was the single strange century, when we decided to make it the enemy. So the next time you hear someone talk about this plant like it's some shocking modern vice, you'll know the truth. It is one of the oldest companions humanity has. We grew up together. The ancient Chinese farmer, the Scythian warrior, the Indian holy man, the Ethiopian trader, they'd all be baffled to learn we ever treated it as a crime. 6,000 years of history has a way of putting one strange century in perspective. From Stone Age rope to a Siberian ice tomb, from sacred temples to a cynical smear campaign to today's slow return, that is the genuinely weird 6,000-year history of one very famous plant. If you learned something you were never taught, and you want more of history's strangest true stories told straight, subscribe. And we'll see you in the next one.